Stuart Holbrook has spent his life in the world of collectors. As president of Theriault, the world's leader in the auction of antique dolls and figurative art for over 30 years, he's managed the often personal and always wild world of collecting and collectors. His market expertise and knowledge of trends comes to life in The Curious Collector, where he shares his experience and experiences in real-life stories, alongside sage advice on how to build great collections within the happy life of a collector.
Hello, everybody. Stuart Holbrook back with you on The Curious Collector, episode number 30. And I'm coming to you, as I always update you on my whereabouts in the world right now in New York City. New York City. I always say that. Like, I don't know why, but like a Texan who's like, you're in New York City. But yes, I am. So today, if you, on this broadcast, if you hear sirens and helicopters and God knows what other noises out there in New York City that you hear, you know why, and I apologize. Nothing I can do about it. I can't yell out, hey, everybody, keep it down. I'm doing a podcast. But it gives a little flavor to the atmosphere here. And, of course, Tammy is in her studio out in Los Angeles and enjoying, I'm sure, much warmer weather because it has turned to fall. But I'm heading all through the Northeast in the beautiful fall colors. The trees are turning, and I'm doing more table talks. I just did one yesterday in the town of Mullica Hill, New Jersey. A great group of ladies. We had a lot of fun for about 3 hours. And next up, New Brunswick, New Jersey. And then it's up to, I don't know, where am I going? Pennsylvania, New York State, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Toronto, Canada, and finishing it all off in London, England on December 2nd. So that'll be the end of we added a few, so I don't even know the exact count at this point, but 65 to 70 of these lectures across America, Canada, and the UK, talking about dolls and the future of collecting. And I really feel it's resonated with people. It's been a great experience for me. But I am looking forward to the home stretch on all of these. And then when it's all done in December, I want to sit down in a podcast and share with you my thoughts of collecting across America and the things that I've learned from people, and give a breakdown of all these great towns and clubs and people I've met over this time, rather than just the little intro I do here whenever we start off The Curious Collector. So I don't even know what my intro will be after I finish my table talk. I'll be like, okay, I'm in such and such and I'm working. These table talks have given me so much flavor in my life as well of things to discuss. So I'll miss that part of it for sure, and miss the interaction with the collectors. And that's one of the things I'll deeply talk about when I give my review in December of Table Talks Across America, is that interaction again, because we get so little anymore in society of sitting down, breaking bread, having conversations, and talking about shared passions and laughing. And it's so invigorating. It's so restorative, I would say. And so it has been fabulous for that for me. And I hope it's helped others as well in having people out there talking and engaging them in these small and large doll clubs all over. So anyway, we're here today to talk about interesting subject. You know, a couple months ago, I did a podcast that was actually really well received. I had a lot of comments from people about it, and it was why we stopped collecting, because it's a subject I don't think anybody's really tackled before, in the reasons why. And I gave all the breakdowns, and a lot of people identified with certain aspects of it, and it helped them also to be able to maybe recognize some signs when they get to that point and either accept them or say, no, I need to change some things, which I gave some pointers to. But it leads up to another topic, which is the actual reverse, let's call it. And that is, why do people start collecting? So, you know, it's such a basic thing. We're all so close to it at times. We don't really necessarily think about what was the catalyst behind it all. What began this process? Not just what started it, but what continued it and where it led to, and what is it somehow all connected as one. And so I thought I would tackle this a little bit today. It's going to be a bit rambling, I would say, but I actually did talk to some collectors recently to kind of get their ideas of exactly what it is that was as I use the word, catalyst behind their need to collect. So we're going to kind of talk about this and go off in a lot of different directions. So bear with me as we work through these different ideas. I also did a Facebook post about a month or two ago. Oh gosh, more than that, probably about 6 months ago, where I posed this question to people, and I had some good responses, and I want to read some of them to you because I think it will ring familiar tones to a lot of collectors. So in starting out with this idea of why we start collecting, and you can probably all take a moment right now, take a pause, think about that beginning for you. What really led to that? In this case, we talk about dolls, but as I always say, it could be really anything that you collect, baseball cards, comic books, anything along those lines. But we use dolls because it's the wheelhouse and it's a large segment of the audience here. So we talk about dolls and kind of take a moment, think for a second. What was that first doll you got? Why did you get that doll? What led to it? For some people, they may not have even purchased that doll themselves. Maybe it was a gift from a relative or something along those lines. But then what about that doll that was given to you led to your becoming a collector? So think about that for a second for yourself, because we're going to dig into this to see if it resonates with you as well, if you find this connection. But really, there seems to be two elements to really talk about right now. The first one being, are you a collector at all? Is it in your genes? Do you have this need to assemble more than one of some particular category? And then we could talk about why that category is the one that you chose. The first thing is, are you a collector? I read an interesting article that I think I've talked about before in podcasts, or if not in my lecture circuit. There was an article I read that 40% of the population in America considers themselves collectors. And that could be a collector of anything, baseball cards, comic books, dolls, you name it. So that's a really staggering percentage when you think about it. And they wanted to understand what it is behind this need of collecting. And I've talked about before how it relates a lot to the idea of identity. There's two parts, identity and self-preservation. Identity in that the dolls somehow reflect something within you that you want conveyed. They're an extension of you. And I talk about the woman who was the epiphany for me in my career in 1993, Mrs. Cameron in Colorado Springs, who when I went to see her about selling her collection and told her about everything that I would be doing and all we would present for the auction for her, was being more of a commodity Stuart, I call him, the businessman side of me. And I hadn't really developed empathy yet to realize the powerful words she was about to tell me that would change my life, my career, and help me dig more into understanding the heart of a collector. And that is, she said, well, all of this sounds fine, Stuart. And she got tears in her eyes and she said, but when the dolls are gone, who will I be? And I remember those words, who will I be? They have stuck with me all of these years later because it is the essence, a lot of your collecting. They are part of your identity. They are part of your personality. They are part of something that you love and wish to protect as a result of that. So ultimately, that's one factor. Then you have the second factor in this study that they discovered was that collecting objects like these that you are passionate about for whatever various reason may have been the motivation, that it is a form of self-preservation. And this fascinated me because my first reaction was self-preservation, but it actually is. Think about your collecting. You are protecting the objects, but you're protecting the objects not just from the essence of history. You're protecting them because they are an extension of you. And you also, collectors, even if they're not really understanding it in themselves, they are protecting them for the future, for after they're gone, because those dolls will tell not just the story of the dolls, they will tell your story. The story of your collecting, the story of your passion, the story of why. And they will carry a bit of energy on into the world, into future generations. We all know where we're heading down the road, so it's no big secret. And so this ultimately becomes a way to extend yourself beyond our bodily presence on earth, that they carry a part of you. And so there are these two factors that I think are very powerful motivators into not just the idea of collecting in itself, but decades and decades, a lifetime of collecting, and it becomes impassioned. But there's so many things to unpack here as to what creates this phenomena of collectors. The first one, of course, is the 800-pound gorilla in the room, I call it. And that is that I believe is the foundation of collecting for probably 80% of the people out there. Now, I don't have data on this. I haven't kept track of it over the years, but it is a recurring theme that is all directly related to this one word that every collector associates with right away, and that's nostalgia. Nostalgia has a tendency to be the influence of beginning to collect. And you see this in a number of different things in our lives. I talk about how collectors tend to be older. That is, they come into collecting as they age. You're seeing more and more Gen Z collectors these days, and I talk about a lot in the future of collecting. But typically, serious collectors really develop in their 50s and 60s. And there's a number of different reasons. You have empty nest syndrome, you have more time, you have more money, but there is something that you really have that is powerful at that point that is developed as you age, and that's nostalgia. People who are 24 are typically not overly nostalgic because they're 24. Their nostalgia is kind of recent history. Now, they can have fun with it and they can communicate with the objects of their youth and engage with them, but it's not the same as collecting them. So you'll find that most people come in their 50s and 60s. And I try to use an example of a phenomena that you're seeing over the past 30 years that has developed that I think directly out of nostalgia and created a booming industry. And that is nostalgia-driven music coming out of bands who are going back on tour. I mean, my God, Rod Stewart is on tour right now. I look at him on the stage and I'm like, oh, God, is he going to make it through? I mean, the guy is still giving it. And why? Why are they doing it? Because there is a big audience of nostalgia. Tammy, let me ask you a question.
Yeah.
Now, I know, and this is probably something that, people know you as a doll collector and a radio personality, but they don't know that you were actually involved with bands who were in the nostalgia field for quite some time, touring with them. And you were with
the Ohio Express.
Ohio Express. Yeah. What was the audience like at these shows that you were touring with them on?
It was an interesting audience because there were younger people there who had learned about the music from their parents and were singing along. But it was primarily, the audience was the same age as the performers on stage. And I think Paul Revere summed it up the best.
Not the revolutionary.
No, not the guy with the horse.
the singer, yeah.
Right. Paul Revere and the Raiders, who was a terrific guy, just one of the most fun performers and one of the nicest people in the world. Paul summed it up. We were doing an interview once, and I asked him, I said, what's it like, Paul, singing songs that you have sung now for the last 40 to 50 years? And he said, Tam, he said, I'm not in the music business anymore. He said, I'm in the memory business. He said, I take people back to when they were 16 or 17. And if you watch the audience, if you actually watch from backstage from the performer's perspective, you could actually see transitions. You could see, people who look like serious accountants and so forth, bopping around and singing the words
or crying to a song out of a memory.
A breakup song. Yeah. Oh, forget about it. Yeah. I still do that in the car when they come on the radio. Absolutely.
Oh, that's it. Thanks, Tammy.
Sure.
And music is probably one of the most powerful triggers of nostalgia there is. And that's why there are all of these bands who are having pretty good careers traveling around the world doing these remakes. They haven't made new music in 30 years, as Tammy just said in some cases, but they're having a great time playing to the memories and playing to people who want that moment of nostalgia to go back to their youth. I always say this, it's something I see in myself. There's a certain point, I think, kind of in your mid-40s, your late 40s, that you really do stop engaging in the same way with new music, that is new acts, new genres, new bands. And you tend to be more listening to the music of your younger days. And I listen to mostly music of the 80s and 90s now. That's my wheelhouse. And it's very happy for me to listen to that because it reminds me, though I'm happy now, it reminds me of other days and happy memories, and it triggers nostalgia. Nostalgia is powerful, and music gives us a platform to really understand how powerful it is. And so I think if you relate it into collecting, you understand it really is no different. And a lot of people come into their collecting moment out of nostalgia for something in their youth. Now, it can be not just nostalgia of something they had in their youth, but as we saw with the great accumulator generation of collectors, that is those who collected from the 1960s through the 90s and the early 2000s, that they were primarily collectors who came out of the Depression era. And they had nothing. They didn't have dolls. And so they were the great revenge collectors, I call them. And they were the ones who would accumulate $2,000 to $3,000. So youth has a direct impact on what you collect as well as how you collect, because they would collect a lot, far different than collectors today who grew up in different times, who might be more nostalgia triggered by things they had as children. And they don't look at revenge collecting in the same light. They look at rekindling some of the nostalgia of their youth. So obviously, though, that doesn't necessarily mean you're only going to collect the items that have nostalgic tendency towards you. And remember, the nostalgia may not be, people mistake this in the world of dolls, at least, to understand that nostalgia doesn't have to necessarily be something you grew up with. It could be related to something that your grandmother had and you remember it as a young girl and she showed it to you. And it could be an antique doll and you loved that doll and it always had mystery to it. And she was always so, you can't touch this. You can't play with it. You can only look at it. And so that kind of brought even more of that mystique to the piece. And later on in life, you remember that. And that doll always has happy memories for you. And so you start studying about an antique doll and you get into it. So Tammy is a collector. And I've known you since you were in your early 20s. And you have been a collector all this time. You started young, which is unusual.
I started at 12. Yeah.
12. Okay. So I'm curious because I think your story is going to click with a lot of people. Everybody's different in how it starts, but it all clicks out of nostalgia. How did you start? How did this all begin?
It's really kind of bizarre that something so small blossomed into something so huge. I was a child performer, primarily doing tap dancing. And so growing up in the 60s, watched a lot of Shirley Temple movies, of course, right? One day I was watching one with my mom, and my mom, who had grown up in the 30s, she mentioned Shirley was so popular, they made a doll of her. And I'm like, you're kidding, really? And I'm like, I have to have one. We have to find one. How do we find one? They were almost 40 years old at that point. And so we started scouring the antique stores and the garage sales, and we found one at a garage sale, 13-inch, not that great condition, only had her slip in her shoes, and we bought her. I think we paid like $20. And that was that. My mom then mentioned, you know, a lot of the child stars that you watch, like Margaret O'Brien and Judy Garland, they made dolls of them too. That ignited a blaze. I was immediately off to the library. I remember the book Dimples and Sawdust and getting all these books and starting to study and find out about these dolls. And coming home after school and actually sitting with the yellow pages, calling antique stores, saying, do you have
the yellow pages?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, you're dating yourself now.
Oh, I know it. I know it. But, you know, it is what it is. You got to face fact, right?
That's right. That's right.
But I would call antique stores and say, do you have a Margaret O'Brien? Do you have a Deanna Durbin? And my mom would come home from work and say, we have to go to this store, and off we'd go. And then, of course, I discovered doll shows. I discovered auctions like Theriault's. And as I learned about more dolls, I just got more involved. And there's the story.
And it kind of all snowballed. So it started with nostalgia, and that is you grew up watching Shirley Temple movies with your mother.
Right.
And then one day your mother just mentioned about this doll, and boom, that's the trigger.
That was it.
But the foundation was in nostalgia.
Oh, yeah.
The foundation was there. And then there was a trigger that led to a doll, and then it began to snowball.
Sure.
And it began to expand. And you've now had 40 years of collecting.
At least.
And you've expanded far beyond that. So this is the interesting thing for collectors to kind of reflect on, is the reality is, and I talk about this a lot as well, that what you start in is your gateway. It is I joke about this being the gateway drug. And it may be for younger generations now, they may start with American Girl. They may start with Monster High. They may start with Blythe dolls or anything along those lines. And it doesn't mean that's where they are going to halt their collecting. That is, completely focus on it. Some people will. Barbie collectors, because there is so much to collect in the world of Barbies, might just remain solely in the world of Barbie. But for a lot of people, you will expand on and you will begin to develop from there. I mean, I tell the story of Benji in the Philippines, a great collector who started with Tony, which was a childhood doll that he had when he was a young boy in Manila, and he was from a very privileged family. And this doll was a friend because he wasn't allowed to really play with kids in the same manner. And so this doll became a friend of his, given to him by his mother. And he found that in his 40s, and he wanted to kind of discover what that doll was. He didn't really understand its background. And so he researched it, discovered this whole collecting world of Tonys. He started buying up more Tonys. But in a few years, his fascination and curious nature led him into other genres and other dolls. And now he has one of the greatest collections of French bébés and German characters in the world. So that's why I always say nostalgia is the foundation, but it doesn't mean it's where your collecting journey ends. So as I mentioned earlier, I was really intrigued by this and wanted to hear more stories from collectors as to what it was in the beginning that led to their collecting. And so I posed this question on Facebook and got some interesting responses. And I actually thought I would read a few of them to you to see if they connect to you as well, because they kind of tell a similar story. You will see how nostalgia plays into this, and you will probably see a little of yourself in some of these. So one of the responses was from Victoria in Australia, a great collector that I've known for some years. And I'm going to read to you exactly her story. I loved my dolls as a child. Growing up as a teenager, my family and myself loved and collected antiques as well. One day in my 20s, in the local antique shop window, I became enamored, obsessed with a German child doll about 14 inches tall. She was not for sale, just display. She was part of a small doll collection the antique dealer's family owned. I would regularly ask about the doll, and they wouldn't sell it, to no avail, except they did take it out of the window to show me. One Christmas morning, my mother surprised me with two antique dolls, a small German bonnet doll and a Simon and Halbig lady doll. I don't know why she mentions this, but on the wrong body, okay? They were from this same dealer. I was in love, exclamation point. Finally, after about 3 years, these dealers sold me that little German doll. I could hardly believe it. I started reading books and decided what I really love are French dolls. My mother died soon after, and we were given some money from her work payout. And on a trip to Amsterdam, I bought a closed-mouth Techumo in a size 0 FG fashion. I still have those French dolls and will always keep them. The other German ones that I once loved have been long gone and forgotten. So I guess nostalgia has an expiration date. Sorry, Victoria, but I love that. Until I read your post here, Stuart. So anyway, you can see from Victoria that she loved her dolls as a child. And there was another part of this, too, within the nostalgia, is that her family also loved antiques. So that combination, as she hit into her 20s, actually engulfed her into a much earlier stage, perhaps, in beginning her collecting journey. So that's a great idea, but you see, nostalgia's at the foundation. This one is from the collector Holly, who says in her response, as a little girl, I had a framed print of Renoir's Little Girl with a Watering Can over my bed, which I adored and still have today. And my present doll room is full of framed Renoir prints. My collection of French bébés comes in part from my love of that Renoir painting as a child. Now, there you go. Another nostalgic trigger of childhood. It wasn't necessarily dolls, but it was that visual aspect of this young child in France in the 19th century and the discovery of the fact that she could, as a collector, find similar things that trigger this nostalgic pang in French bébés, which look like a lot of the young girls in the Renoir paintings. So that's a great one as well that I love. This one is from Carol, and I know Carol very well, great collector out of St. Louis. And she said, I always loved dolls, and I hated it when I was deemed too old to play with dolls. I remember being in 7th grade and age 11. I was playing with my Barbie dolls on the floor of my bedroom. Barbie and Ken were getting ready to go on a date in Barbie's green convertible. Okay, she's recounting the story of how she would play with the Barbie and Ken. But I glanced out the window and I saw my junior high crush walking across the lawn toward my house. With that, I took my arm and swept all my dolls under my bed. I was terrified he would walk over and look in my window and see that I still played with dolls. When I was 23, my aunt gave me my grandmother's Kessner doll in bad need of repair, knowing how that I loved dolls when I was younger. I took the doll to a doll repair lady. She had fabulous French dolls she collected and sold. With my love of antiques, dolls, and history, I was hooked. Thus began the joy of playing with dolls again. So again, you see nostalgia, playing with dolls, led to a relative giving her an antique doll, which I have found is something I'm hearing a lot from different collectors. They had that nostalgia, they had dolls, but they came into antiques because a relative passed on a doll to them and they became even more fascinated by it. This one was really interesting to me, and this will be the last one I read to you. This is from Anne. Barbie dolls were hands down my favorite pastime as a child. I loved them, in all caps. I always wished for a ponytail Barbie, but never got one, but loved the dolls I did have. Fast forward to early marriage. At a flea market, I spied that ponytail Barbie. She was $17. That was $17 we couldn't easily spend as a young married couple. But that moment was when the doll collecting bug bit. At my sweet husband's insistence, we splurged and bought her. I treasured her. But because I was an adult, I hid her in a closet. It took several years, but eventually I added more dolls and even gathered my courage to display them. That began with Jean dolls. Her 40s and 50s wardrobe with such attention to detail delighted the fashion history buff in me, which led to a few treasured antiques, also fashion related. Backing up a bit, my parents went through an ugly divorce when I was young. I was very upset by it. Recently, in a therapy session, my therapist mentioned that perhaps the reason I was drawn to dolls was because they represented the happiness and security of childhood before the hardship of the divorce. I think he hit the nail on the head. I wonder if anyone else out there has had a similar experience. For me, dolls bring fun, creativity, and great friendships. So this was really fascinating to me. First, you saw her as a child loving dolls. Then you saw her as a young adult, just married, seeing that doll she always wanted as a young girl and buying it secondhand, but still not ready yet to be a collector until she aged a little bit, until her nostalgia really started kicking in. And then she began into Jean dolls and other things. And that's when the collecting took off. But what I really loved was Anne's very introspective and personal thing that she shared, in that as an adult, in talking about in a therapy session, the doll collecting, realized and saw that it may have been a result of remembering this idealized child before her parents had a divorce, and how it was kind of almost wanting to return to that happier time and that happier moment. And you'll see this appear in a lot of people. And I mentioned before that collecting out of nostalgia can also mean collecting something you didn't have or something you were deprived of as a child, but it could also be a trigger to go back to a happier moment of childhood before maybe things change for the worse in your life later on, and wanting to return to it. So we can analyze psychological things within everybody, and everybody has their own deeply personal relationships with collecting and the reasons why. So I find all of this absolutely fascinating. And then I get to one that was really interesting to me. And this is a great collector out of California, Lucinda Tinsman. And Lucinda started off with a few things, but I'll get into the meat of what she really said. But to answer your question in all seriousness, I lived in Paris until I was 7 and got to see French dolls. And my parents were popping into antique stores from time to time. But I think when my interest in dolls really took off was when my parents took me to the doll museum at Legoland when I was 5. Let me interject right here. If you don't know that, it was one of the greatest doll museums in the world for many, many years in Billund, Denmark. And we actually sold that collection. I've talked about it before in, I believe, 2007, 2006, somewhere around in there, and was a revered museum for many years. But anyway, Lucinda goes on. Since they were antique collectors, they wanted to find an adjacent collecting field for a little child. And so when we moved back to Washington when I was 7, they took me to the Gaithersburg Doll Show, where I fell in love with a certain doll, and then magically she appeared under the Christmas tree from Santa Claus. So began an annual tradition that provided the playthings that I gave tea parties for, made costumes for, told my confidences to, and generally played with as Victorian child might have. I also had many opportunities to just gaze at their beauty in awe. So in a time when I've been confined to my house for 3 years now with an injury, I rediscovered this early passion as an adult, this time finding quite a bit of intellectual figure in the pursuit of mold identification by facial sculpting, especially of the French poupées. So now I feel like in addition to a pleasure that I feel gazing on them every time, it is providing a kind of field for detective work. So this was wonderful because this captured it all. There were so many multiple levels to this. 1, loving dolls as a child. 2, parents who were antique collectors. 3, parents who encouraged her to have a few antique dolls even as a child. And then she lost interest. She moved away from those, but again, came back to it later in life for whatever reason, found that nostalgia pang for those dolls of her youth, and with that foundation began and is in the process of building, I can tell you, a truly great collection. Oh, now, let me read you one more because this is a funny one because this will lead into the idea that it's not always nostalgia. Remember I said I'll figure it's 80% nostalgic is the foundation, but for some people it could be something totally different. So Karen Cheek, another great collector who's living in Salt Lake City now, and I've known for many years, she said, well, I was not a doll kid. My poor mother, desperate for a girl, gave me a tiny tear she carefully dressed when my brother was born. Her hope was that I would care for my baby while she cared for him. She told me and reminded me that I actually hung it from the willow tree in the backyard. Oh my gosh. And then she gave me a sweet Sue, which I promptly had her leg amputated. So I have no childhood doll stories. I liked microscopes and chemistry sets. I know, but I do absolutely love history and discovered dolls with a friend who loved them. I'm drawn to the woodens and paper maches because for me, they are an expression of women and history. So there you are. It's not always nostalgia. And this is very important when people try to put collectors in a box of anything childhood related to think it is a return to childhood. For many people, it is not. I talked recently with a great collector in California and wanted to dig into her origins and how she began. And so I asked the natural thing. Tell me about when you were young. Were you playing with dolls and you had really fond memories of this and that was the trigger? And she said, I don't really remember if I really played with dolls or didn't. I think they were kind of there, but I didn't really have any strong relationship one way or the other about them. No, that wasn't really what got me into this. And so I was kind of surprised. I was like, okay, well, that's interesting. Well, what did? And she said, well, and you need to know about her. Collecting reaches a lot of different genres and levels, from automatons to French fashions to bébés to miniatures to early English woodens. There's a whole gamut. So I said, well, what led you in? Well, the first thing was, parents were antique collectors and loved going to flea markets and antique shops all over. As a child or as a teenager, and then in their early 20s, she would also go down. She grew up in New York City. She would go down to the Mary Merritt Museum in Pennsylvania with her parents who were just visiting different flea markets, and they would go there occasionally, and she was intrigued by the dolls and that perspective of history. But eventually she would become a fashion designer, become successful in her career. And she later on started getting into wanting to learn more about certain dolls from an aesthetic standpoint that is fashion oriented or theatrical. And that led to automatons and led to French fashions. So it wasn't really necessarily about anything related to the doll itself. It connected to things she loved. And then she ended up in her collecting, evolving into another passion of hers, and that is design. I mean, she is a designer, a fashion designer, but she loves all sorts of design, including designing interiors. Has a beautiful home, beautifully designed with French antiques and furniture. And she saw the dolls as a mannequin, as a form in which to create vignettes and scenes that could extend from there. So creating whole little lives going on in parlor rooms and bedrooms and all of these things that really intrigued her as a collector and became part of the joy for her. So there is another totally different catalyst for collecting that didn't really arise out of nostalgia, but there is, again, a connection to youth in the sense that she did grow up around antiques. Parents were antique collectors, went to flea markets. In her teens and 20s, she would go to Mary Merritt Doll Museum and then later on come back to it. But it had been kind of enforced into her as youth. So when you ask, a lot of times, it's kind of interesting. I'm just thinking about this right now because you hear so many collectors say, my kids don't care about my dolls and they don't care about antiques. They don't care about old objects. And kind of wondering, is it because we don't get them involved in the idea of this and the fun of collecting and the history and the art of antiques at a younger age? When they're 7 or 8, we let them play with new objects. That's fine. But do we take them to auctions? Do we take them to doll shows? Do we tell them stories about some of the antique dolls or any antiques for that matter to help them at a younger age have more of a nostalgic remembrance of this, of something they shared with you as a child that will later be triggered when they enter into their nostalgic golden age of 50s to 60s of saying, gosh, I remember those days when I was a little girl and my mom used to take me to doll shows or antique flea markets or whatever. And I remember that because Tammy said earlier the exact same thing. Her mother started her with nostalgic watching of Shirley Temple movies and then mentioned to her about dolls and started taking her around to antique shops. And for Tammy, that was a really happy memory of that time period. So this is something that could be interesting in analyzing as to why your kids, who you generally are talking about, are in their 20s, 30s, 40s, and you say, well, they don't care about my dolls. And maybe it's because you didn't start them off in understanding the importance of them at a younger age and getting them involved in not just hearing the stories, but taking them out to some of these places. As well as we saw, with going back to Karen Cheek's comment, which I really loved. Well, not the part where as a child she hung her doll from the willow tree, but the fact that she had no real nostalgia towards dolls in her childhood, that they later came on in life as an adult through accidental discovery of antique dolls through a friend and realizing how they became a three-dimensional representation of history, especially of women. And that was something she was truly fascinated in, and saw the dolls as a way to be able to display different periods of fashion, different times in history, different movements, and why she migrated more towards the early wooden dolls and paper maches of England and Germany. So this is another part, and I see this with a few people. Interestingly enough, another collector I know, I'm just thinking of this now in California, really started collecting again in her 20s, I believe, or teens actually, originally in Chicago and then in California. And I believe in talking to her that she would trace her collecting also not as much, okay, I guess it is a love of history, but it's an idealized romance of a different period that she grew up idolizing, especially a love of England, and which led to a collection of incredible English wooden dolls that she's amassed and many other things as well, especially early dolls, because it's a period in time that she was really fascinated with historically. So history can be a foundation for some of those people, but part of that might be steeped in nostalgia, because if you look at this person I just talked about, it was steeped in the nostalgia of a period that she never grew up in, but she idealized, read about, studied, and romanticized in her mind. And the dolls allowed for the ability to capture that. You know, it's funny. We argue I guess I argue with Florence about this, and where I say we need to be calling these pieces, we need to be calling our hobby one more of figurative three-dimensional art representing the human experience. And Florence just kind of waves her hands at me and says, no, Stuart, they're dolls. Don't ever discount the power of relationship that people have with something that was very impactful to their youth and help them in their development. It is a very emotional thing that you don't understand necessarily. So you're trying to take it into something, I think she even uses the word more hoity-toity. And so I don't even know if that is actually a word. I need to find out, where did that word originate from, hoity-toity? But anyway, so in this sense, I see we're both right, because you can trace all of these collectors and their origins and see the different meanings behind it to realize they are figurative art representing the human experience. But in the same token, they are dolls that represent the nostalgia of childhood. Why can't we have two things at once? We can. And that's where we need to kind of start thinking about this. But going back on this, I'm really fascinated as well with the idea of collecting dolls in other cultures around the world, in other places. If you look at Japan as an example, with a huge collecting base, Europe is a given. I mean, a very similar upbringing, similar dolls, similar pattern of youth. But Japan, when you look to Asia, here you're starting to see very different values and raising of children, and different as such levels of nostalgia as you age and what you go back to as a child, or even different understandings and impacts of history and how that might lead to your collecting. So when you take Japan, that's actually more understandable, because dolls obviously are a big part of Japanese culture and have been for eons. And we know of some of the great Japanese doll artists and Japanese dolls that were produced over the years, not discounting even the cultural ones like the friendship doll, which have become so vitally important to history nowadays. So we understand and know how dolls intersect with this in Japanese culture. But how did that lead to Japanese becoming such significant collectors of French dolls, as an example? It's perplexing if you don't understand all of these different triggers that we've been talking about. The reality is, interestingly enough, if we're talking about nostalgia, I have noticed there's not that much of an ingrained marketplace in Japan for a lot of the youthful cultural dolls that young children played with or had, like the Boys' Day and Girls' Day sets in Japan. There's not much of a return to those as nostalgic collecting. But there is a passion for French bébés of the 19th century. So why would they want those? There's obviously no nostalgia there. They didn't have these type of dolls as a young person. So obviously what it is they had the idea of dolls already there, and they grew up with dolls. They were Japanese dolls. But the Japanese, we do know, also love French art, love French objects, love European luxury goods. And as such, this developed into a education and a learning about the history of these dolls. And they saw the aesthetic beauty of them, and they were very different than something that they had. So again, there was nostalgia there because they'd grown up with dolls, but history and the aesthetic of the 19th century French objects led them to start developing a collecting culture there that really sort of blossomed, I would say, in the 1970s and 80s, and grew from there into its current state, where it's one of the largest collecting bases in the world. But one that's really interesting me now is China, because China is starting to develop as a collector market. And it's fascinating to me because I have very little contact and conversations with any of these collectors in China to be able to understand and learn more about what started it all for them. Well, let me just say, dolls themselves in Chinese culture is not a typical thing. I don't know if a lot of you have read about dolls through the history in China, but they have typically always been associated for burials. That is, you are buried with a figure, typically clay, wood, whatever, very crude, not very lifelike. And as such, they're associated more as a burial piece. And so young girls didn't really play with dolls. I've read articles about in the 19th century, they introduced some of the luxury European French dolls in Shanghai, and nobody would even touch them, let alone buy them. They were like, why would we buy this? It's associated with death to us. And so I really was fascinated by that from a historical standpoint. But then the new result of suddenly we are seeing collectors emerging all over China of antique 19th century dolls and early 20th century as well. So I'm zeroing in and looking at what are some of the things they're buying. Well, one of the most popular categories for the antique dolls for Chinese collectors are googlies. First of all, they're not exactly what I would call lifelike. They aren't necessarily mimicking us. I always think that googlies sort of extend into the future of what you would see with fantasy or comic character type things, but even further on, expanding into pop culture of today. And that's where China has become huge. And we're going to do an episode soon to talk about the phenomena of Labubu. No, you're kind of thinking, what? But yes, we are going to tackle it. And I'm going to bring on a person that I met recently who is the foremost Labubu collector in America to discuss this a little bit and understand what is behind this, because you have heard about it here, but what you haven't heard about it in China, it is absolutely gone bonkers. Everybody is Labubu crazy. So when you think about this, again, they're not realistic. They're not lifelike. They're almost fantasy. They have a similar characteristic to a googly in a sense. So you could see that collectors who maybe entered into collecting through Labubu, I can't believe I'm saying this, but came in through Labubu and expanded into going back and discovering all these antique dolls where the foundation of Labubu were. They could look at Blythe as an example from the 70s. They could go back to the googlies of the 1910 to 1920 period too. So this is a really interesting one to me in that, again, there is nothing nostalgic about a doll in China. Nothing. And they have negative connotations in some cases. However, there is a direct link to current pop culture, which is not necessarily a doll. And as such, they're looking at googlies as one thing, as being representing something totally different than we look at it as. And I'm starting to see with their education and learning about other different genres of dolls that they're expanding into more standard classic pieces too. A little bit on the French bébés there. So they're starting to learn and deep dive into the history of these and develop a relationship with them. And we will see more collecting emerge out. And who knows, it may have all started with Labubu. Okay. I had to say it again. So, Tammy, do you have any Labubus?
I do not. I do not.
Okay.
They're a little too modern for me. I haven't progressed that far.
All right. Well, you're going to learn about them on the next podcast, or soon, I should say. Okay. All right. Well, that's basically what I have for you in my breakdown and my learning over the years. And I encourage you to talk to yourself a little bit and think about it. And one of the things I noticed in the post I did on Facebook is that people said, thank you. This really sparked my interest in kind of going back and remembering, because I'd forgotten how this all started and where it is that I ended up with $350 and multiple rooms filled with them. Where did it all start? And so I hope this helps you deep dive into your own history as well, not just the doll's history, but your own history and what led to it all, to have a better understanding and also to know that we are all different. What is the catalyst for you? Maybe totally different than the catalyst of your best friend who collects dolls, but we all have something shared in this passion for it. And I think it's kind of good to have these conversations, and it helps us to explain to others as well, to people who may more stereotype in the idea of collecting dolls, that we understand and are able to convey to them a little bit more of a deeper meaning into the collecting that will actually result in greater respect for the dolls. Whatever, however, wherever you started, all I ever hope for, and that you know, is that you have the happy life of a collector. And with that, have that deep understanding that we all come from different places. We all have different reasons. And to respect all these wonderful motivations and incentives for us to be collectors, to understand our own history, not just the objects in this process and how it relates to us, and it becomes an extension of us. And as I said before, that you're able to convey that to others in telling the story of the dolls, but your story in dolls as well.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of The Curious Collector. The Curious Collector is hosted by Stuart Holbrook and produced by Tammy Trujillo. We invite you to follow us on social media and feel free to leave any questions you have for Stuart on Facebook at Stuart Holbrook-Theriault or follow the Theriault Company Facebook page. And you can stay up to date with the latest auctions and events at Theriault.com. We'll talk to you on the next episode of The Curious Collector.